So it would make sense that we have the power below the seas, on the seas, and above the seas. And remember Logtown and Dragon? And remember that gust of wind in post-war? Is Dragon Uranus? Hello my fellow wannabe Straw Hats and welcome back to the One Piece saga. The series covering my never-ending journey of watching through One Piece for the very first time, giving my thoughts on it, and ranking each arc in a tier list to determine which is unquestionably, definitively, and definitely not just in my opinion, the best one. In case you're just joining us, this is part 2 of my Fishman Island videos, so feel free to check out the first one in case you missed it. But we've got a ton to talk about, so without further ado, let us dive in. We left off with Jimbei wrapping up his story about Fisher Tiger and Queen Otohime, and that is exactly where we'll start. And the very first thing I want to bring up ties into a lot of what I talked about in the first part. The looming shadow of Arlong and how that has affected Nami. Obviously, after hearing that Jimbei is the one who set free Arlong and didn't stop him in quite a few instances where he could have, we would expect Nami to have at least some mixed emotions toward him. But before she can say anything, Curly Eyebrow butts in saying that Jimbei should pay with his life? I'll just read out my notes to you here. I think you've lost too much blood, Sanji. Sit down, you are seriously not all there. But jokes aside, am I just out of touch with the story, or is Sanji seriously this terrible? Like, who says that? Even if he doesn't know Jinbei's the one who literally saved Luffy's life, read the room, man! I'm writing the script and recording even before the Return to Sabaody video has gone out, so I still don't know whether I have been cancelled by the Sanji stans or not, but absolutely all jokes aside, what happened to his character? I never thought one of the most OG members could fall so low, but here we are. Anyway, Nami, someone with an IQ and EQ higher than the average temperature at the bottom of the ocean, unlike Sanji, speaks up saying that she holds nothing against Jinbei. He never did anything to her, and it's clear that he just did what he thought was right. First of all, this is the type of answer I'd expect from a crew that has been through as much as the Straw Hats have. I think the fact that Luffy is friendly with Jinbei should already confirm for the crew that he is to be trusted, yet Sanji seems to have completely missed the memo. But number 2, and this is genuinely funny at this point, was Sanji also sleeping through Jinbei's story? Because like, he does realize he's continuing to push for violence exactly how we literally just heard in Jinbei's story? How oblivious do you have to be? I mean, what's next? Will he tell Garp to pay with his life because he didn't break out Ace? TLDR, Nami is amazing and Sanji is terrible. Oh, and Luffy just snoozing through the entire thing is absolutely brilliant, by the way, but something tells me it's a bit more than just a funny gag. I think him not hearing that story will in some way come back into play, but that is merely a hunch and I have nothing to go off of. We then cut over to Robin, who's made her way to the poneglyph we heard about before. Though as she reads it, we learn that it is an apology from someone named Joy Boy. And oh boy. At this point, I knew things were about to get a lot more complicated. For the sake of simplicity, let me tackle the whole Joy Boy thing here, as it wouldn't be until the very last moments of the arc that we heard more. But yes, as of now, we know that 1, he left an apology/promise to a certain mermaid for an unknown reason. Number 2, he lived during the Void Century. And number 3, it is said that someday someone would come and fulfill it on his behalf. So, someone like Luffy who promised to protect Shirahoshi, safely brought her to her mother's grave for essentially the first time, and then used the legendary ship Noah to essentially unite Fishman Island, and it just so happens that Shirahoshi is also the legendary weapon Poseidon? I hope you are ready for some heavy tinfoil, because here we go. As I talked about last time, prophecies by their very nature are often self-fulfilling, but for the sake of this theory, let's follow up the pretty clear parallel between Luffy and this supposed Joy Boy. And because good theories don't rely on other theories, I won't even bring up my entire headcanon from previous videos. But let's go. We now have Luffy, someone who has an incredibly strong resemblance to Roger. But now, he seems to be fulfilling the goal set out by this Joy Boy with whom to, at least on a surface level, he also seems to have a strong resemblance to. And then there's the name, Joy Boy. I mean, come on, look at Luffy. If he ever had a nickname, it would be Joy Boy, because he's the most joyous boy of all. Or is he? There just so happens to be another person who laughed in the face of death, both of whom did it all the way back in Logtown. Luffy and Roger. Now, we also know that the Will of D is something that distinguishes certain individuals as ones with incredibly strong wills. But what if the lineage of the D also resembles the Grand Line? As in, there's only one path to each individual. And in Luffy's case, while his form of the Will of D might be the same as Roger's actually comes from Joy Boy. So basically my thesis here is that the thing that actually links Roger and Luffy is in fact the spirit of Joy Boy. All we need to find out now is this joyous boy's real name, because something tells me he may turn out to be the original person with D in his name. And if you want a completely baseless prediction, I think Joy Boy is also a pirate captain who conquered the Grand Line and is in fact the first ever person who found Raftel. And because he did that, something in the world changed and that part of history was just erased. And ever since then, those with D in their names somehow just so happen to converge in a fight against the world government. Again, this is completely baseless and I'm just drawing on a bunch of tropes and putting them all together with something that sort of makes sense. And I guess since I'm already wrapped up in tinfoil, what is up with Hordy's transformation once he popped the energy pills? Does that remind you of anyone else we've seen before? Indeed it does, our very own Chopper back in Eni's lobby. As we'll talk about in a bit, he now has the form under control, but I seriously can't help but think that unlocking this sort of latent power is super sus. Oda has been super intentional with this sort of stuff, so two characters now both gaining massively empowered abilities simply by taking some magical stimulant, one of which can now use it without using said stimulant, makes me wonder about the potential powers that lurk within everyone else on the crew. Obviously Hordy doesn't even have a fruit power, so perhaps at the end of the day, the most powerful thing is Haki? Everyone has it, right? So while Chopper might not have known how to use it, he might have been using it unconsciously and the stimulant just brought it out and massively empowered his abilities. But regardless, very, very curious indeed. But alright, for now, those are all of my tinfoil theories. The next thing I want to bring up is something far less fun and joyous, and those are the methods of instilling fear that Hordy uses. Just like I said in the previous one, this was honestly hard to watch. I really don't want to bring in super dark and serious tones into what I hope to be a fun video talking about fantasy pirates, but there's one thing here that particularly stood out to me, and that was how Hordy wanted to dehumanize his enemies. If you've read about wars and conflicts in general, I think you'll know exactly what I'm getting at, because this is exactly how these sorts of things go down in the real world. Getting people to fight is very, very difficult, but if you make them believe that they're fighting something less than, it becomes much easier, and those very, very real undertones are what hit particularly hard here. Again, yes, in the grand scheme of things, I would agree with the sentiment that Hordy is a fairly one-note villain, but I would also say that he's an incredibly good villain because of how much you want to hate him and because of how realistic he actually is. And to prove that point, let me give you a thought experiment. Whenever Hordy talks about humans, replace it with fishmen and vice versa. See how his arguments remain unchanged? That is exactly because that cycle of hatred, as much as neither side would like to admit it, is propagated by both. Hordy and his zealous methods are obviously wrong, but it's not like the humans are saints either. It's that moral complexity that makes this arc so interesting in my opinion. And there are plenty more things that Hordy does that are incredibly dark, but I am not the right person to talk about them. So let's get back to something that I feel far more comfortable with: pirate shenanigans. Though with that said, before we get to those pirate shenanigans, there is one very big and glaring problem that I already raised in the last parts, but rings particularly true here. If you're following very closely, right now we are on episode 548, or in other words, 24 episodes into the arc, and we've barely seen any of the crew, let alone all of them together. I'm not talking about the pacing or things like that, I rather mean the very structure of the story itself. Right as they arrive at Fishman Island, they are not together right up until the final battle at the Plaza. And for me, that's one of this arc's biggest problems. But that's the thing, it's only this arc's problem, because in any other arc, I would have never brought it up. Yeah, the crew splits up, that's just how it goes, right? But this is not just some arc. This is their first proper adventure after being split up for literal years in-universe and like 5 arcs for us as the viewer. Literally the only thing I wanted to see here was all of them together. And again, no matter how perfect Otohime's and Fisher's stories were, we don't really know them and we're all waiting just to see the crew again. I can already see how this arc is much better on a reread or rewatch, because you're not just biding your time until you see the crew again, but on initial viewing, I think switching around some of the events might have improved the experience for me at least. Obviously fitting in Jimbei's flashback anywhere else would have been incredibly difficult and likely made the arc feel a bit disjointed, but I don't know. As it is right now, I think many people will not really enjoy it to the fullest because of those pre-existing expectations that are not exactly met right away. But with that said, it's here that everything I just said changes, as Luffy says that they need to free their crew only for Jimbei to try and stop him, saying that it can't be Luffy as he'd only be seen as the aggressor again. Number 1, I loved how Jimbei's plan was revealed to us, because I'll be honest, I was so caught up in the hype that I was like, oh, Jimbei will fight Luffy now. Okay. But yeah, their brief scuffle was tense, that's for sure, but hey, at least Sanji sort of got what he deserved, right? Before you leave that comment, that was a joke. I may despise Sanji, but I still don't want to see him beat up for no reason, so please, Sanji Stan 299, delete that comment. Anyway, yeah, I absolutely loved how this whole thing plays out, because we obviously see the whole Jimbei trap thing, etc, but it's when we flash back to him actually telling Luffy the plan that we get a couple of scenes that legitimately almost killed me. First off, we get the absolutely stone cold exchange between them, where Jimbei just promises to give him all the meat as long as he plays by his plan, and Luffy's simply like, okay. And better yet, Jimbei then, as serious as before, asks whether they should pick a codename for this operation. These scenes really had me laughing out loud. Perhaps it's exactly because of the extreme contrast between what we just heard and what we're now seeing, but whatever, it was brilliant. But with all that out of the way, we finally get to what, let's be honest, each and every one of us was looking forward to. The crew in action. For the sake of time, we obviously won't go through everything that we see here, but I do want to tackle some of the most important bits. First of which being something that actually has nothing to do with these scenes at all, and is more so a general feeling around this whole thing. I already touched on this in the first part, but throughout the whole arc, it was pretty clear to me that Oda does not want the crew to get hurt in any way. So all of this just boils down to them flexing on these dudes, which should probably seem dangerous, but they clearly aren't for a leveled up crew. And perhaps best of all, because it is such a snooze fest for most of the crew, we've still yet to see the full range of their new abilities, which is definitely something I'm excited for. Though next up, I want to talk about how this fight actually begins, and that is with none other than our captain himself. And oh man, the scene of Luffy, calm as ice, walking through the crowd and hockey blasting 50,000 of them was just like, what? And that scene of even Hordy being absolutely shook by who he's about to go up against only made that entire feeling of the crew being absolute units now much more pronounced. Then of course, there's Chopper, who's unlocked a whole bunch of new forms which he can now use whenever or however he wants. And while yes, his new Kung Fu boost and all that was awesome, especially because he now appears to be extremely versatile, what I am super interested in now is what happens now that he has gotten his beast form under control. Oh, and speaking of which, I also think the whole contrast of Chopper seemingly going all out with it, only for us to find out that it's no big deal at all, was also handled very well considering just how destructive it was before. But yeah, what happens if he pops 3 Rumble Balls now? Beast form plus? I'm not entirely sure because his beast form seriously looked like the endgame for a zone type power. So perhaps there is something even more there? You know, perhaps taking a book out of Norse mythology and transforming into Eikthirnir? Just saying. There's also Robin, who has seriously upped her skills. Not only can she now create massive legs and whatnot, she can also literally clone herself, so that's pretty cool. Though that now makes me think what the extent of her power is. Will we reach a point where there are 15 Robins fighting a single enemy? Who knows? The one I was looking forward to most, as I think most of you would expect by now, was of course my boy ZORO. And while he did showcase some of his new abilities, he never really got the opportunity to properly flex on anyone with all of his new techniques, since none of them really posed much of a challenge. Though the Black Robe Dragon Twister thing was pretty cool. Franky's probably the one that had me cracking up the most, as his power-ups are absolutely wild. Number 1, because this is anime we're talking about, obviously he'll have a mecha form, so there's that. But probably my favorite thing here was the Tang that's now a part of the Sunny. Commando Chopper seriously made me bust out laughing, and I mean yeah, the sheer absurdity of this whole thing was incredible and I seriously loved every second of it. As for friendly lightning god Nami, she also zaps a whole bunch of them, but we don't really see much more than what we already saw back in Hody. And this is actually where an idea popped into my head. Considering that most of the crew now has a highly specific set of skills, I'd love to see more direct matchups sometime in the future. ZORO always gets a sword fight of his own, right? So why can't Nami have a wizard fight while Usopp has a sniper off? I think these sorts of natural matchups would be cool to see and give each member of the crew plenty of room to showcase their new abilities. So yeah, I'd love to see something like that. Though speaking of Usopp, one thing that I didn't mention is the whole parallel between his matchup in Alabasta and the one we see here. And if you recall, I really was not a fan of it back in Alabasta. And while I wouldn't say it was my favorite fight here either, I did like it much better than the original. Maybe because I found Miss Merry Christmas incredibly annoying, but who knows. And just for the sake of time, the last one I want to mention is Brook, but not really what he does in this fight. Rather, his ability to detach his soul from his body. I am making a prediction right now. This ability is completely busted and will never be used again. The sheer convenience of literally being able to pass through walls with zero limitations to gather information is incredibly overpowered, and I am willing to bet that it will be conveniently forgotten exactly when it would be necessary. Since most of you are likely up to date with the story, you already know if I'm wrong or not, but that is my prediction. No spoilers, please. Oh, okay, and one last thing. The invisible dude who constantly came up with reasons why he was defeated was one of those jokes that could probably happen 50 more times and it'd still be funny. The one that seriously tickled me was the "you've taken a headbutt to the foot" moment. It was just so ridiculously brilliant that I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it and wonder how he's even made it this far. But with all of those cool moments out of the way, I do have to admit that the entire battle for the Plaza was incredibly forgettable. As I've said multiple times, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because I love the whole the crew is not in any kind of danger and outclasses their opponents to a ridiculous degree, but at the same time, it gets old quick. Especially because Luffy's fights, which we'll get to in a bit, is sold as a little more serious, which makes everything I just said feel even more weird. We've already seen Luffy pummel Hordy with the most basic of his punches. We know that if they were to fight properly, Hordy is absolutely no match for Luffy. And while yes, the angle of Hordy leveraging his Fishman abilities makes perfect sense, I do think that, in story at least, it is conveniently prolonging the fight by essentially removing Luffy from the equation altogether. I haven't really brought this up before, but I have noticed that in some arcs, Luffy is conveniently removed from the plot because it is clear that if he were to go up against the big bad, he'd win right away. Thriller Bark is probably the most prominent example where he literally ran around the forest for a while. Don't get me wrong, this isn't some massive writing flaw or anything, absolutely all stories create these sorts of conveniences, but for one reason or another, it was particularly noticeable with Hordy. Especially because he was deliberately powered up throughout the entire arc with the energy steroid. Remember that ZORO literally one-shot him while underwater, so the whole transformation thing and then kiting Luffy into open waters seemed like a super convenient way of making sure this matchup lasts more than 3 seconds. And in a broader sense, while yes, Jimbei's intention was for Luffy to save Fishman Island, and that would be that new link for human and Fishman relations, but at the same time, I don't see why they couldn't have taken on Hordy together at least, or tried to slow him down so that Luffy could fight him properly. I mean, that is what Neptune's sons did after all. But anyway, enough of that. There are a couple of moments in this one that were still incredible. Most of all, Luffy's Red Hawk. At this point, I don't even care for the explanation. Sure, you can say friction or whatever, but let's be honest, it looks cool, it's a callback to his brother, and that's all we care about. And yes, the shot of Ace sort of channeling his power through Luffy was incredible. Then of course there's the whole elephant Gatling, which was also brilliant, and confirms a line of thinking that I had when we first heard about armament hockey in post-war. If he uses it, we see his body turn to sort of metal, I guess? And I'm calling it now, the next form of this is his entire body becoming that. In my mind, it's pretty clear that if he can now apply it to parts of himself, when the next big battle calls for it, he'll go hard enough to coat himself entirely. So yeah, prove me wrong. And the very last thing I want to mention here is what Hordy answers to when he's asked about what humans ever did to him. He mutters just one word. Nothing. And follows up with, "We were chosen by heaven to punish humans." It was at that moment when all of this arc's build-up finally shows you what that endless cycle of prejudice has done. Because as Hordy himself says, humans never did anything to him directly. He was merely created in that cycle of hatred. In essence, he exists in Arlong's shadow who never really thought for himself at all. And again, yes, in terms of complexity and motivations, obviously he's nowhere near the likes of Blackbeard, but I still think he is a very good villain because of how narrow-minded his goals are. Which nicely leads me on to the other major problem I think this arc has. The other primary villain, Dekken. I'll say it right now, literally the only interesting thing about him was his fruit power. Absolutely everything else was a massive disappointment, especially because the Flying Dutchman was used for him. And while I just raved about Hordy, this felt like yet another instance of One Piece just not being able to commit, because once again, Dekken suffers supposedly fatal injuries that are not fatal at all. And considering how zealous Hordy was already, it just seems weird that he didn't finish Dekken then and there. But anyway, even disregarding all that, Dekken was just not a character I cared for at all, and largely feels like an afterthought. Though returning to the story, we get to what is hands down the most beautiful moment in this arc. Jimbei giving blood to Luffy, breaking the cycle by not repeating to what happened with Fisher, and finally showing everyone that their blood is one and the same. Thematically, I have to say that this is likely the strongest arc for me yet, and its message is beautifully captured in this scene. Very similar to what I said in Post-War, Jinbei's and Luffy's dynamic is incredible and one that I seriously enjoy seeing, so it probably does not come as a surprise that I was eagerly waiting for that one question, which Luffy does very much ask. Will Jinbei join the crew? If you recall, I've already talked about how I'm not sure how exactly does Jimbei fit into the crew, so while I truly want him to join, I can't say I was too surprised when at the end of the arc we hear that things are a little more complicated than that. He wants to accept the offer, but he can't just yet. I am very much holding out the hope that we will see him properly join, but as of now, I'm just happy that we got to see the incredible moment between Luffy and him. I'll be honest, even if there are more complications and he can join again, as long as we see him fight alongside our gang again, I don't think I'll be mad. But seriously, Jimbei, come on, join up with us. But with the fight finally over, we see Shirahoshi call the Sea Kings, which drag the Noah away, which is when we get the flashback to Roger hearing the voices I talked about last time. As I already said, my running theory is that this is the voice of the universe which we heard about in Hody, and it's also the same reason why Luffy could also hear them and talk to the Kraken at the start of the arc. The Sea Kings themselves even discuss how they suspect Luffy heard them, so running on that assumption, it makes me wonder who was it that told Roger about the blank century then? Remember that the whole reason why Rayleigh even brought it up was because he said that Roger and their crew never deciphered the writings in, presumably, Raftel, and that it was the voice that said something to him, implying that what Roger heard was in fact a retelling rather than a first-hand account as it was written on the poneglyph. But remember that the poneglyph that Robin just found was written by Joy Boy. So considering we have someone like Robin with us, who, unlike the Roger Pirates, will be able to fully decipher the writings, does that then imply that the Straw Hats will be the first to ever hear the first-hand accounts of the true history? Though that then makes me wonder how that plays into the whole Spirit of Joy Boy discussion we had before. Surely there must have been a reason why the voice of the universe spoke to Roger and Luffy specifically. As far as we know, the only ones capable of speaking to the Sea Kings are fishmen. So how come Luffy and Roger are different, and how does that link them to Joy Boy? Alright Oda, you've got me once again. Guess it's time to think about this for the following 3 months again. Thank you very much. It's also here that we get the revelation that 1. Caught me by surprise, but 2. Is one that I really liked. We hear that Shirahoshi is actually Poseidon, one of the ancient weapons. I'll admit, I was kind of ashamed for never even considering the possibility that the ancient weapon is not actually a physical thing, but rather a being or innate power. But I really enjoyed this sort of surprise. Now, if memory serves me right, we know that Pluton, one of the other ancient weapons, was a ship of some kind. So we now have something to 1. Traverse the seas, and 2. Use the power of the seas themselves. So, is the other weapon one to control the skies? Uranus is literally the personification of the sky after all. So it would make sense that we have the power below the seas, on the seas, and above the seas. And remember Logtown and Dragon? And remember that gust of wind in post-war? Is Dragon Uranus? But anyway, the fight is now over and it is party time. But because this is One Piece, reveals do not end there, as we hear about a substantial shakeup in the Navy. Notably, we hear that opinion was split whether it should be Akainu or Aokiji who becomes the successor of Sengoku. And of course, the only way to solve this is with a good old fight. Number 1, I want to see that fight. But number 2, we hear that Aokiji couldn't accept Akainu's victory and left the Navy. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but technically, Kizaru was the only admiral we know of now? I'm guessing those seats must have been filled, so who knows who they are. But something tells me it won't be long until Aokiji ends up on our side. Feels like a very deliberate name drop not to amount to anything. Another thing we hear is that Blackbeard is supposedly going around hunting for devil fruits. And to me, this is pretty clear. I think he's looking for a third fruit power, which, I'd wager, is the most powerful of the zone types. He already has what is supposedly the most powerful Logia and Paramethea types, so a zone type just fills that last tick box. I have been thinking about why 3 is the magical number for him ever since Marineford, and the only real line of thinking I have is the Curse of the Fruits. Perhaps carrying multiple fruits, or according to my own theory, multiple souls around, makes that curse even more pronounced. Maybe when you have 2, the sea literally begins to tear you apart or something. One of the last things we see in this arc is very much set up for what's coming for us in the new world as we see Big Mom's pirates arrive. Without getting caught up in all the details, so far, I am absolutely loving the vibe of our crew, and they seriously remind me of Ni no Kuni for some reason. It does seem like they're going to be pretty big adversaries for the Straw Hats, but hey, at least they seem to be ones that I'll actually enjoy seeing. And all of that is complicated further because Luffy gave away the treasure that has been booby-trapped without even knowing, so it will literally look like an assassination. TLDR, Luffy vs Big Mom is very much on the cards. However, this might be another bizarro theory, but remember Lola? She said her mom's a extremely notorious pirate. Something tells me having Luffy go against an emperor one-on-one is not a good idea. So I'm calling it now. Big Mom is Lola's mother, and that's how we're actually going to avoid a proper confrontation. Nami's going to notice that the Viva card is pulling in her direction or something along those lines, and that'll calm the entire situation down. And one last thing that I loved here is Luffy's promise to Fishman Island. After the death of Whitebeard, as we've already heard and seen, chaos has sprung up basically everywhere. So Luffy promises to claim Fishman Island as his own. Coming off of the super dark and often downright hopeless things we saw back in Impel Down and Marineford, seeing Luffy be back to his very ambitious self was awesome. And hey, it's not like he hasn't already called out someone of this caliber before, right? And there's one more really important note here, and I know this is something you were probably looking forward to. Nami does indeed get a new log pose with 3 needles. Now, I've gotta be honest, if you remember my stupid dragon joke, that was very much a stupid joke. But when I said the whole log post 2.0 thing, that was much more of a 50-50 prediction and joke. The whole one guide not being enough and needing 3 is a classic trope after all, so while it did give me a very good laugh that I actually turned out to be right, I can't really say that I was that surprised. But what I found alarming is that the moving one is usually the most dangerous one. Come on, you seriously expect me to believe that it's not going to be the one we go to each and every time? In fact, if you want a totally baseless prediction, I'm expecting another individual who has gone that route. Blackbeard. We'll see how that plays out. And the last thing to mention is the pinky promise between the crew and Shirahoshi. Literally nothing else to say here aside from the fact that it seriously made me crack up. Luffy just wrapping his finger around hers is just perfect. Okay, and one more thing. The scene of the kids wanting to wear straw hats to be the heroes of Fishman Island was super wholesome. Though with that, the crew sets off and we very much get a scene a la the Reverse Mountain as they find themselves getting caught up in a current. And I know this might sound a little weird, but I absolutely love how we're seeing the legend of the Straw Hats being written right now. As far as I gather, they most certainly did not go the traditional route. But let's be real. Remember that time we caught a ride with the whales sounds a lot more interesting than just sailing into the new world with no hiccups, right? It's one of those things that are easy to overlook with all the shenanigans the crew gets into, but those side adventures are often those that make the whole thing worth it in my opinion. So while yes, the whole whale scene was a little bit random, I do admit I loved it. And before you ask, yes, I am incredibly silly and I actually fell for it. I legitimately thought that was Laboon for a second. But with that, they emerge in the new world, and needless to say, it already looks like the Grand Line on steroids. But I absolutely cannot wait to see what this new chapter has in store. And that's Fishman Island. And oh boy, is this a tough one to rank. Thematically, this is hands down the strongest arc for me, but character-wise, it is a very mixed bag. With Hordy, in my opinion, being brilliant, but many of the side characters and even the other main villain were incredibly forgettable. And structure-wise, it's also a bit of a mixed bag for me. As for much of it, I just wanted to see more of the crew. So not to rehash everything we just talked about, for me, this is a B tier arc, coming in at just above Skypiea. With this one more than ever, I can already see how on a rewatch that might change a lot, but for now at least, that's the ranking. And with that, it's time to finally set sail into the new world and make our way to Punk Hazard. And that's the video. Well, that's our first two-parter out of the way, so let's see whether this will become the norm moving forward, or maybe I'll be able to somehow squeeze in everything into just a single video. Only time will tell, I suppose. But with that, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. And let's give a warm welcomes to the newest members of the team, Kyle Quinnell and Caldazar Atriides. I think I butchered the pronunciation. But without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my rambling, so seriously, thank you, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.